Hi, I'm Jochen Eisenbrand. I'm Chief Curator at the Vitra Design Museum and looking forward to speaking with Cat Rossi. Cat and I curated the exhibition Night Fever, Designing Club Culture 1960 to Today together. The exhibition was shown here at the Vitra Design Museum, then at the Design Museum in Brussels, our partner in creating this exhibition. Another co-curator, Nina Seroulis. Hi, Nina. It was then shown at the Centro Pecci in Prato near Florence, and then traveled on to the Design Museum in Copenhagen. Oh, there you are. Hello, Kat. Just saying where our exhibition traveled. The last venue was the Design Museum in Copenhagen, where it opened to 2,000 guests, a stunning opening. And then, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, the show had to close after having been open for only a few weeks, and it was eventually taken down then. But it will travel on to Scotland and then even later to Australia. So great pleasure to speak with you today, Kat, about club culture. Kat is a design historian, writer, curator, author, and she's an associate professor at Kingston University. She's writing for magazines and newspapers on design issues. She also co-edited a book with Alex Coles on the Italian avant-garde of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Currently working on another book with Alex Cole on contemporary crafts. Yeah, and probably busy teaching as well, except for now in August, I assume. So, yeah, I mean, the club culture currently is in deep crisis, as so many fields and industries, but club culture has really been hit especially hard because until now nothing's happening. How is the situation in the UK currently?
Sure. First of all, say hello, Jochen. It's nice to see you again. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this. Just on a technical note, if my Wi-Fi isn't great, then I can always switch to 3G, such as the challenges of these platforms.
Yeah.
So your question was about the current situation and the challenges facing nightlife. I mean, what can I say? I'm not sure there are really enough words to describe the challenges facing nightclubs and the nighttime economy more generally. In the UK, to speak specifically, all nightclubs were told to close on the 20th of March, and there is no date currently for their reopening. Now, there were plans for music venues to open in mid-July, but due to concerns over a rising number of cases, then that's been there's been put a stop to that. And I think when we're thinking about this pandemic, nightclubs are so vulnerable, and in many ways the most vulnerable out of all nighttime and cultural spaces. Dancing is about physical intimacy, often with different strangers. It can be about intoxication, which can undermine your kind of social distancing behavior. It's about loud music, which requires people to get closer and speak louder, and there's increasing evidence on actually how that increases infection rates. And then, of course, there's a challenge of people going to multiple venues in one evening, which has been causing some issues around pubs in Scotland, for example. So it just seems like nightclubs are really incompatible with this new, temporary, but we don't know for how long, world that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Have there been any attempts of the British club world to unite, to at least raise awareness for their problematic situation right now?
Yeah, in terms of the club world, there have been organisations like the Nighttime Industries Association, which is an advocate for nocturnal industries more generally. So they've been doing, a lot of research, a lot of advocacy, a lot of lobbying with government. Also in London and in Manchester, that both cities have night czars, so they've been working hard to support industries on the ground. And then, individually venues have been taking part in crowdfunding schemes, in doing live streaming, other kinds of funding streams that they've been trying to set up. And actually, on a positive note, there has been some real creativity, I think, in terms of some of the initiatives that have been devised.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's comparable in Germany. There's been a big initiative, United We Stream, that you may have heard of, that started in Berlin, was started by Berlin clubs, and then really reached out further, first to other cities in Germany, but then really across the globe. And it's I think more than, how many was it? 360 locations, 1,800 artists that have been streaming sets or concerts of all kinds, and I think more than 1 million people who've seen this.
Yeah, I was one of those million. There was Manchester has its own United We Stream, and they did a day-long hacienda kind of themed
Oh,
rave, or however you want to call it. So I was dancing away in my kitchen at that.
uh, great. Yeah, yeah, same here. And has there been any government support or financial support by communities, by the cities, for which this nightlife is also so important for the city's economies?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, there has been some support. So in May, the government announced a £1.5 billion refugee package for the UK's arts sector more generally. And we
Mhm.
also have a national body, well, for England has a body called Arts Council England that has developed £500 million cultural recovery programme, it's called. And nightclubs are amongst the cultural associations who are eligible to apply for them. But there's still lots of concern over the viability of this support. And, you know, some nightclubs haven't been eligible for the furlough scheme, for example, or just a lot of the labour, a lot of the economy around nightclubs is, you know, is concealed, is precarious. So actually the reality of how much, what the quality of the official support and also how much it reflects the reality of the industry, I think has also been another challenge.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that also seems to be similar here. That in some instances, the club scene doesn't feel taken to be taken seriously by
Mm.
officials still, even after all this time and so many cities actually employing night mayors. But yeah, still have
No,
to
I agree.
fight this image of yeah, I don't know, being not serious or uh,
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, it's something I'm interested in general is kind of really showing the value of, I mean, other people have been doing work in it, but really showing the value of nightclubs to the creative and cultural industries, for example, I think is really key.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, and another thing that has happened here is that, of course, people who want to go out, they don't have any place to go, so they gather in inner cities and are just outdoors, and then yeah, and then sometimes police comes and wants to sort of make sure that social distancing is still happening, and then it doesn't, and then there were really some moments of riots as well in the city of Stuttgart, in the inner city, or in Frankfurt, which shows that clubs also have this, I think, this moment that it's a way for people to just, yeah, go out at night and let off steam. And
Yeah.
if not possible, if you don't have that, it happens elsewhere. And
I
yeah.
mean, yeah, goodness, we've been confined for months. I mean, everybody I think, just wants to go out and get out and dance. I can absolutely understand it. I mean, we've had a similar problem really here. I was reading that in London alone in July there'd been over 500 illegal raves, which is, and it's happening all up and down the country. And it really is, yeah, it's a massive kind of phenomenon in a way. And reading about it, there's some sort of nostalgia around this is the third summer of love, you know, following
Oh,
from the 80s and 90s. But
uh-huh.
but the reality of it is a lot more dangerous now, right? You know, it's the kind of health and well-being of those involved, particularly as we understand more and more that, you know, young people are being affected, but also with the
Mm,
residents. And I think one of the saddest things has been seeing footage of the day after when there's just rubbish littered all over the streets, which doesn't really seem to be in the spirit of, well, of this kind of collective community kind of orientated world that we, you know, apparently want to be trying to create now.
mm, yeah. Uh, yeah, in that sense, it's really unprecedented, these challenges and how to
Yeah.
deal with it. So I mean, maybe to dive a bit into the history of night clubbing, how did your personal interest in this topic start?
Well, from a position that I never thought would lead to where it is, which is always one of the fun things about research. So my research, I'm a design historian, as you said, and it started with one nightclub. In fact, a photo of one nightclub called Space Electronic, which opened in Florence in 1969, and which was designed by Gruppo 9999, an architectural collective associated with Italy's radical design movement. And this photo, which was a tiny photo, was of a vegetable garden planted in empty refrigerator boxes laid out on a nightclub dance floor. And I came to this because I was interested in what this said about radical design's relationship with nature. You know, what are vegetables doing on a dance floor? But then also, and that's still a question that kind of tickles me. But I also became really interested in the fact that Gruppo 9999, and as it turned out, other radical architects were designing and running nightclubs. And actually, not only is that, I think, really interesting to think about architects being involved in this kind of activity, but also it's something at odds with a kind of understanding of radical design as being a movement that was really about paper-based activity rather than actually building any physical spaces. And it just went from there.
Mm-hmm. And so you actually discovered that it wasn't only paper-based, but that there were actually radical designers and architects creating spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. So so Space Electronic is where it started for me, and that was in Florence in the late 60s. And Florence was home to also a nightclub designed by a super studio called Mac 2 that only lasted a couple of years, and apparently had a terrible acoustic problems, I think. And then in Turin and Milan, which were the other kind of centres of radical design, there were other nightclubs designed by groups, including architects from Gruppo Strum, who were another radical collective. And on the Florence coast, there was a club called Bamba Isa, designed by Gruppo UFO, which was this amazing tiny space. I mean, not necessarily didn't have to be big, but it was a space that was only open in the summer, and it changed its decor every summer. So it was a very, these are kind of sites of expression, of experimentation, really.
Yeah. Like theatrical, almost like changing stage sets from summer to
Absolutely.
summer.
Yeah, and I think particularly there, they were the carnival industry is located nearby, so you can see kind of links between all that kind of fantastical world that they were creating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also traditionally creating sets and having the means to do that, or the craft to
Oh
create
yeah,
such paper mache or yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
And why do you think was it? I mean, it seems that Italy at that time, the late 60s, early 70s, was particularly vibrant, and there was and why did architects and designers, particularly in Italy, delve into this nightclub scene or into this idea of creating this new typology of spaces?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, and I think there's a real tendency to mythologize Italian design in this period as being, the kind of most creative episode in 20th century design. That's absolute hyperbole. But I think it's really interesting to think about, it's partly born out of a lack of kind of real building opportunities. That's always been a challenge for post-war architects, which in one of the ways is the reasons why so many architects got involved in product design, for example, or furniture design. But also it was a form of rebellion against what was seen as an overly commercial, overly commodified sector, and also a sector in terms of building and architecture that was struggling to kind of find a new language beyond modernism, beyond that kind of the utopia that modernism offered. So nightclubs, which, as you know, were a kind of relatively new type of space at the time, were really seen as they weren't seen as commercial spaces yet. They weren't seen as defined spaces yet. No one necessarily said what could and couldn't happen in a nightclub. So particularly actually through kind of education and through articles that talked about the possibilities of these new kinds of spaces that were seen as more participatory, for example, then they understood that these were interesting spaces to explore. So many of these many of the nightclubs exemplify what one of the architects involved, who was called Pietro de Rossi, he called them pluridiscos. And that's, these venues didn't just host music, but they had live poetry readings, they had theatre performances, they had art happenings, they had architecture festivals, and of course they had vegetable gardens as well.
Uh, did they, do you know, did they ever make anything of it? Or did they really grow those salads there? And then, uh,
No, it's all staged. As you said, it's the theatre. They
mhm.
there are photos of them plucking those vegetables from someone's allotment, hopefully one of theirs.
Mm.
And yeah, I don't know, I don't know what happened to them. I imagine they went a bit sad after a few days.
No. So the spaces were very much about flexibility and the
Mm.
furnishing about being modular and so that one could change them according to what was happening in there. And
Yeah,
what were the spaces they used? I mean, they did move into existing buildings, didn't they?
yeah. I mean, in the case of Florence, because there had been this flood, this historic flood in Florence, and I'm going to forget the year now. Maybe it was 67. Which kind of you know, it was a kind of tragedy. It decimated a lot of spaces, but it also left some spaces available. Um, and both the spaces in Florence that been talking about are both underground, and that's, you know, always a kind of key feature of nightclub architecture, is that they're often underground spaces. And then in Rome, in the Piper, which was really seen as the first disco in Italy, that was actually in a building that it wasn't so much an abandoned cinema as a building that was designed to be a cinema, but then never was used as such. So it's kind of massive empty space that was seen as kind of well, ready and waiting to be turned into something interesting.
Hmm. And then, I mean, you had seen that photo, and then you started on your research, and that you quickly then connect to the architects and designers who are still, some of which are still around.
Yeah, so the research started kind of with publications as a, you know, kind of conventional academic, and then I was really lucky that this has really led into a more curatorial direction. So in 20, well, I was invited to curate an installation for the 2014 Venice Architecture Biennale, which was a wonderful opportunity to have. And for that, I looked at space electronic, but I thought about the fact that as you say, at the time, the main architect, Carlo Caldini, was still alive. And not only that, he told me one day that he was still running the nightclub. You know, it was still going. It was a still going business, but obviously very different. You know, much more commercial endeavor than the kind of experimental life that it had before. And I was really interested in that tension between a building physically still being there, but, you know, the idea of the atmosphere, the kind of activities inside being so different.
Hmm.
And then that led the next year to an invitation to co-curate an exhibition at the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, with a curator there called Sumitra Upham. And for that, we looked at this kind of broader phenomenon of other architects in Italy involved in designing nightclubs in the 60s and 70s.
Hmm.
And following on from that, I got a very nice phone call from yourselves to think about this as an expanded, much more expanded kind of subject.
Hmm. Yeah. And from the in the academic world, was that ever met with any skepticism that you were looking into the sort of mundane world of nightclubs?
Oh, I must only ever meet with nice academics, because no one's ever questioned my that this is as a subject. I mean, I think, you know, if you're talking to, there's always this idea that it's quite a frivolous subject. Of maybe that's not just within academia, just when I'm talking to, you know, kind of people outside of research. But I think as soon as you start to talk about the kinds of spaces that we're talking about, and the kind of the quality of the thinking, the quality of the names involved, and that these are very particular kinds of spaces that we take for granted, then, you know, I hope at least that there's some understanding that actually there's a kind of, you don't want to get too serious, but there is a kind of serious story to be told about their value and their heritage.
Hmm. Yeah. And what I found so interesting about your research with these Italian clubs is that it was also a platform for artists to show their work, and that some of them were related to arte povera even.
Yeah, that's true. So in Turin, in the Piper disco there, as you say, there was a very close connection with Arte Povera, which was the art movement based in Turin in really centered into in the 60s and 70s. So they had various happenings there, including Piero Ghilardi, who designed these. They were called kind of nature rugs, and from memory, they had them both up on the wall, so that the disco was an art gallery, but also they had models kind of walking around in these kind of experimental outfits. And even the Piper in Rome, which wasn't seen as so much a kind of experimental space, also had artwork hanging on the walls. So a very, in some ways, like Italian design at the time more generally, a very cultured idea of what a nightclub was and could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in a way, also about expanding space, or opening the notion of space. I mean, it was a time when the artists went out into the fields, and this earth art came up, and artists actually left the museum and left the studio to work in the country, and work with earth on the other side. Then these artists were bringing nature into the space, into the club. A bit of a hippie thing as well. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more that we, obviously with a contemporary lens, we look back to that period, then we understand this kind of environmental impulse that was there, particularly in the 60s and 70s. I mean, I think the thing that I should say about space electronics vegetables is that actually the space was highly technological for the time. So they had, they had what kind of light projections all over the venue, but also they had CCTV cameras installed at different points in the venue. And that wasn't about surveillance, as you might expect now, but actually that was inspired by the media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who saw electronic technologies like TV, and you could say CCTV, as ways of connecting people. So you might be in one part of the nightclub, but then you can look through these kind of cameras and see into other parts and see other people dancing in different spaces of the club. So it was really about bringing nature and technology and man together. That's what Group 9999 were interested in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In a way, these streamings happening now are an extreme sort of version of that. I mean, the streaming of these sets particularly, and it's really in a way also connecting the world. I mean, people dancing to the same sets in different places of the world at the same time.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, to think, and I think this is, I'm sure some people are looking into, but I'd like to look into more, is how much can that kind of sate, when that feeling of being in a physical space with other people. I mean, it's something we're all thinking about generally in terms of people working from home, for the most part, that sort of thing. But I think when you see the advent of digital nightclubs, like Club Quarantine, and also Quarantine digital nightclub, and it's the kind of Zoom screen of like multiple people dancing. Yeah, can that offer the same kind of collective community feeling or not? And I wouldn't want to make a judgment on that, because I think that's partly a different generational kind of question as much as anything else. If you're used to having lots of communities, or being part of a community spread all over the world, maybe you don't need to be physically in the same space. Well, for me, actually, it might be a different kind of need.
Mm. I haven't seen that Club Quarantine. So that's a sort of a web platform that you join, and then you're in this virtual club together.
Yeah, there's a few different online clubs, and I think the ones that I know of are only born as virtual nightclubs, so they're not an extension of a physical nightclub. And there's some of them replicate the idea of the nightclub as having different spaces within it. So there's like a VIP room, or there's like a hidden room that you find out at some point in the evening. Or you can go and be friends with someone and go and dance on your own together somewhere. So it's thinking about replicating the different social structures, the different experiences you get within one physical space. So it will be interesting to see whether that's a fad, or whether that continues. Or actually, I think more likely is that in the future, nightclubs, or in one future, some nightclubs will have this kind of hybrid digital physical quality to them, where some of the audience, if that's the right word, will be at home, and some of them will be in the space.
Mm. Yeah. And I mean, maybe there's also a bit of this whole gaming thing coming into play there.
Yeah,
Because I mean,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I
yeah,
think some of the I think I was reading about a Singaporean nightclub that as part of their kind of their live streaming, they had kind of gaming elements to the funding of it. I mean, I'm not a kind of expert on that, but yeah, you can absolutely see that there's links between the gaming industry, but also gaming as a way that people experience spaces or phenomenon.
yeah. What I was going to say is that I've also two sons, and they spend a lot of time in front of their computers gaming, and I
Mm.
find that a very passive as probably any parents, and urge them to go out, but for them it's a means to exchange. So they're at home, and at the same time they're meeting with friends. And I think in these clubs, then that may be a similar thing, except that
Yeah,
gaming thing, you're not moving. It's not. I mean, except for your fingers on the joystick. It's like no body action yet. And yeah, but who knows? Maybe that'll change.
I think that would. I mean, I think that that will change in some ways, and also as um, I stumbled across a product that's maybe been on the market for a year or so called Mirror, which is a home gym device. In essence, it's a mirror that is kind of I'm going to use the wrong language. It's digitally augmented. So you're looking at the mirror, and then suddenly your personal trainer appears on the mirror, or suddenly you're in a class full of other people taking part in yoga, and so you're physically not in that same space, but you're very much you're moving and you're connecting with people in quite an absorbed way. I think that actually maybe you do forget, you know, the space that you're in ultimately, which actually, if you think about being in a nightclub, then if you're lost in the moment, then you don't think about the space that you're in actually.
Yeah, yeah. And on the other hand, one has been observing in the nightclubs before the pandemic that many people bring their phones anyway, and if it's a very intense moment, they actually film it or at that moment share it with someone somewhere else. So it's really on both ends of it, at home, but also in the club, that these two layers of that physical moment and a virtual elsewhere, yeah, have this overlap. So it may
Yeah,
actually be a generational thing, because I'm always personally, I have my issues with it, and tend to prefer to really be in that moment and not partially somewhere else. But probably for that younger generation, that's something they've grown up with. That's just a normal thing.
absolutely. But I think it does change the idea of the nightclub in some ways because you know it's that idea of it being about a sealed off space, kind of you know private space in a sense, or at least a space divorced from the daytime, from your work life, from whoever else you might be on the street. It's you know these are places for experimentation with your fashion, with yourself, for making mistakes, for you know maybe drinking too much, like for all those kind of forms of escapism. And so know, from my perspective, certainly looking back on my youth, I was grateful that I didn't have that kind of that intrusion or that idea that you're performing in a way that there might be a record of it on another day. But again, I don't like to make judgments about what that might mean for somebody else who might find it valuable for you know a different kind of reason.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And if one looks back at the history of clubs, one might think that some of the things that happened there that were very extraordinary, unusually, could only happen because at that time it was just happening there. They were really protected spaces, like a shelter for things to
Mm.
happen. Couldn't happen elsewhere. Um,
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree.
yeah, but maybe also, I mean, that the younger generation that has grown up with social media is much more used to also sharing any moment of their personal life. So it's not such a big issue for them
No,
to
no, no,
share what
yeah, yeah.
also being in a club.
No, I agree.
Uh, yeah, but also there seems to be more a tendency to look after your physical health and stay in shape, which in the past month has also been especially important for sad reasons. You once mentioned that you'd also looked at the Ministry of Sound and how that has changed into or how they have licensed actually these fitness clubs.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of interesting sub-story around the relationship between nightclubs and gyms. I mean, I mentioned it already. That, I mean, on the one hand, so Gymbox, which is a gym chain, the interiors of those are designed by Ben Kelly, who designed the Hacienda. It's very much the language of the Hacienda, this kind of industrial space, and that's translated into the gym. But then you see a more recent phenomenon, such as Ministry Does Fitness, which, as you say, is Ministry of Sound's incursion into gyms. And actually, one of the more unusual research methods I undertook for Night Fever was taking one of their gym classes, which was about how you can kind of translate the idea of atmosphere. And a lot of kind of house music has that kind of uplifting and also that body focus to it. So in some ways it kind of makes sense that when you're working out, you've got this kind of high energy, this dark space, this use of lighting, but also it absolutely talks about this kind of shift from the seeming shift from kind of hedonism to health, rather than kind of abusing our bodies. We've seen this massive growth of the wellness trend, and it makes sense that partly as you get older, maybe you can't go out so much anymore, but you enjoy the experience of those kinds of spaces, or actually you're just making more what could be seen as healthier lifestyle choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've been speaking a lot about the architecture and the interior design. You'd also been looking a bit into the fashion aspects of nightclubbing and the importance of nightclubs for fashion. For instance, you did some research in the Fiorucci archives, one of the labels that were closely connected to nightclubs.
Goodness, Jochen, yes, you're reminding me now of all the research that we were doing, and some stories that we never really quite got to tell, I think, in some ways. I mean, I guess Fiorucci is interesting as a fashion label that, as you say, is very much certainly in kind of what would it be 90s Italy, but also it has stores in the UK and in the US. That this was sort of clothing designed to go with the kind of clubbing scene, and you might remember the name of the in the store in New York where they kind of had like dancers kind of performing in the space as well, like very much that kind of extension of the nightclub into fashion kind of retail spaces, which I think we see in other ways. But yeah, there's a kind of long and there's a lot of interest in the relationship between fashion and club culture. I mean, we looked, for example, at particularly the kind of 80s scene. So in London, thinking about clubs like Blitz and Taboo, which were quite short-lived clubs in Soho, but actually I think for the history that we were telling, there was often, it didn't matter whether a nightclub existed only 6 months or a year. It kind of managed to have a big imprint. So Taboo and Blitz were two clubs where fashion students would go, for example. So people like Stephen Jones, who's a milliner, who's still working today, and John Galliano. And then the kind of famous, musicians like Boy George, for example, and figures like Lee Bowery, he was a kind of did everything really, but a performance artist and a fashion designer, amongst many. And they would use these clubs in different ways as stages for performing, as stages for experimenting. And you can see not only how that was important to their sense of their own identity construction, but also how that then fed out into the designs that they would then create in a more kind of everyday environments.
So you were speaking about Lee Bowery as one of those performers who really used the nightclub as a stage to show their art, body art and clothing.
Yeah, but also experimental fashion. And I'm sorry, I don't know where I got cut off, but I was saying that he was incredibly influential on people like Alexander McQueen and Gareth Pugh. And then I think more recently, you can talk about people like Daniel Lismore or another British fashion designer, Charles Jeffrey, whose fashion label Loverboy was effectively born on the dance floor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's really, really a platform for this sort of street fashion, but then also moving on to establish labels from that.
Yeah, and actually you can see, as nightclubs have kind of nightlife has become, fashionable in the last few years. You've seen a lot of fashion labels like Gucci, for example, really kind of referencing club culture in their advertising, if as well, or if maybe not so much in the actual clothing themselves. But there's a real currency, I think, to associating with these kind of subversive spaces. Or think about Prada, which we included from their Miu Miu, one of their Miu collections, which was effectively shown as if it was in a nightclub designed by OMA.
Yeah.
So there's a really strong relationship between fashion and club culture.
Right. Or the double club that Carsten Höller created for Prada, and then there was also Dior did something that was strongly inspired by the rave culture of the 90s. And Gucci with that tribute to Northern Soul. I think that was 3 years ago. Not necessarily, as you say, to the clothing, but to that particular kind of dancing. That can also be seen in that video that Mark Leckey created, where he put together different kinds of dance styles from different kinds of club cultures and club tribes almost.
Yeah, I can watch that. That's Fiorucci Made Me Hardcore, which I can watch over and over again. The music in it is so evocative. I mean, it's designed, I think, to kind of to bring out this kind of nostalgia in you. But you can find it on YouTube if anybody hasn't seen it. Fiorucci Made Me Hardcore. But it's interesting also to see the journey of different subcultures as they, kind of become, they kind of move from underground to, well, in some ways you can talk about it as commodification or appropriation or in, a kind of nicer way as a kind of appreciation really of these different movements.
And it shows how it reaches beyond fashion and makeup, and it's really also about bodily movements, that you have a certain way to dance, and that shows that you're part of that crowd or not, because you're not behaving the same way. I mean, really this idea of a club, of being a member of something, being really part of something and belonging to it.
Yeah, like language and body movement, I think. I mean, it's something that we touched on in the show, but I don't think we explored in a lot of depth. I mean, there was so much to explore. Was that idea of the kind of design of dance moves in a way, or the kind of as these sort of design phenomenon that have their own rules and rituals and think about how you learn some of these things. So you'll be practicing that in your bedroom before you go and show it on the dance floor.
Were you going out a lot in your youth when it started, and what
I mean,
and how, what do you think, what are the main changes today, how, as opposed to then a few years ago?
Yes, I mean, I think we both know my youth is now gone in many ways. I mean, like, I don't pretend to be involved in the nightclub industry or an aficionado in ways that some people are, but I like many people, the ritual of night out was fundamental to my kind of my youth, to kind of growing up. I think one of the things that was really notable in coming to do this exhibition was the quality of spaces that I went to for the most part, as opposed to these kind of standout spaces that we were talking about. I mean, while I have been, lucky enough to go to some fantastic nightclubs, actually it's dodgy provincial venues that provided the escapism that I need as a teenager and beyond. But I think, as I've become older and a parent, the nights out are far and few between. But throughout all of this, the importance of dancing, of spaces for escapism and togetherness so important. And I think now, now that we can't at all, I think really realizing it now more than ever in some ways.
Mm. Yeah. What I do find that what has changed to my mind is that the importance of the music as a means of identification. That the
Mm.
music played a much bigger role when it wasn't omnipresent, when you didn't just have it all on your phone, but you really had to go to a record store to buy it, and then a certain club would play a certain music and another one another music, and that also kind of defined what the club was about and what the people were about who went there. And my impression is that that is not such an issue anymore. That it's opened in a way.
That's a good point. I mean, of course, there will be different types of venues catering for different types of communities, defining by music or other kinds of ways. But yeah, that ritual around the kind of acquisition of the music that you might hear in a club, only fleetingly, or yeah, recording it on tape or going to the record store, like that culture around it has changed a lot. I mean, you mentioned Northern Soul, and actually, one of the things that happened there and elsewhere is that the records sold and swapped on the dance floor, because that was really the only space where you would come together necessarily and encounter people with the same music tastes as you. And they might have come from quite a distance, to go to the Wigan Casino, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, nowadays you just have it, you have it digitally, and you have this huge library on your phone or on your computer, so it doesn't have that exclusiveness anymore, and it's also not the club anymore where you listen to certain music first necessarily. um,
Yeah, that's true. The kind of debuting in music doesn't happen so much through clubs. But I think, there's like certain radio stations, radio programs, there's a kind of certain democratic quality to being able to listen to really high quality and new music through kind of digital platforms that you might not access otherwise. I mean, nightclubs, much as I have a kind of rhetoric around inclusivity around nightclubs, they're also quite exclusive places, for all sorts of reasons. So actually opening them up, or opening up the joy that they can bring, is no bad thing in some ways either.
mm, yeah. But there were always also places that were open for groups that may have otherwise been marginalized in society. And I found that interesting on the United We Stream platform. That's something they're also emphasizing, the importance of clubs for being open to all diverse groups of within society, and also those that are maybe otherwise still marginalized. This sort of shelter function.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, one of the um, the kind of closures of nightclubs in London, which I can speak to, there was a disproportionate closure amongst LGBTQ and also ethnic minority groups, and that's kind of disconcerting. The kind of import that they might have for otherwise marginal communities, but also something that I have to say I didn't really clock when we were researching Night Fever, is that all those the kind of values of clubs that I would extol around being, hidden underground, round the corner, up a building, round the staircase, actually that makes them incredibly hard to get into physically.
Hmm.
So that they have kind of access, and there have been some kind of campaigning, some activism around this, that while those qualities might work in one way, they also actually prevent other kind of communities from engaging in them, which I think is an interesting thing if we're thinking about redesigning spaces at the moment, because they meet all other kinds of needs. Then maybe that's something that would also need to be, or could be addressed as well.
Mm. Yeah. Have you come across any solutions, any proposals that try to deal with the current situation?
None that I necessarily think are the solution, if there is such a thing. I've, watching a bit with interest what's been happening in other countries, and in the Netherlands and in Germany, there have been sit-down venues, or venues with like socially distancing, so you stand in a ring. But while that might be a novelty to it, it's not the same. I
Mm,
mean, that's quite clear.
mm,
And there was also a suit that I saw designed that was a bit like you in a hazard suit, but it was a suit for dancing in.
yeah, but
But again, these aren't viable options for clubbing, really.
that was, I think, Production Club, an LA-based studio that
Yeah.
proposed the suit that looks a bit like a space suit, completely sealed off with filters, electrified, that would allow you to, yeah, to engage with others through, yeah, some intercom, and be in the same space, but yeah, still be kind of sealed off, I guess. In
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I'm not sure if it was really meant seriously, or if it was, I don't know. Um, in Germany, there was one club in Stuttgart that has just proposed a kind of ticketing system, that would allow you, an entrance at one club at one night, say during in a month, one certain night,
Mhm.
so that you would have, it would be easier to trace, the people who spent the night.
Mm.
And those people who were there that night would not be allowed at another club for, say, another 2 weeks or 3 weeks or so, so that
Wow.
it couldn't spread. But yeah, again, I mean, it takes, of course, it takes away this spontaneity, from going out, and yeah. But I mean, I guess one has to think in all directions right now. What
Yeah.
could happen? I was also thinking of silent discos where people are wearing headphones, and then are also somewhat distanced from each other. But again, it's not the same interaction and the same intensity, then.
No, no, I think you're right. Yeah, silent disco is an interesting idea. I think, I mean, there's going to be fixes for now, and then there's going to be, I mean, until we know if there's going to be a vaccine or not, then it's like, how much is this a something we have to design in, or is it something that is a kind of design in an emergency situation, but a very odd emergency that we find ourselves in, where we try and go about our daily lives as well.
Hmm. And have you, since the Night Fever exhibition opened, did you come across any other, interesting historic examples during your research? Have you continued working on this, topic?
Well, I took a bit of a break out of work for the reason you heard earlier. I think not so much in the research that I've been doing, but I've been enjoying reading about kind of partly tangential aspects. So thinking a bit more about the history of ballrooms, of other kind of night spaces, and thinking how they link together. But also, I've quite enjoyed, as the Night Fever tour has been kind of going on, how each of the different venues have been conducting research into thinking about nightlife in their own cities.
Mhm.
So, in Copenhagen, we saw the reconstruction of of a, a replica of part of the NASA nightclub
Mhm.
by Johannes Torp. And I know that the team at Vitra Dundee are also taking research into Scottish nightlife. And of course, Nina, our co-curator in Brussels,
Mhm.
also doing really interesting research into Belgium club graphics.
Yeah.
So I think that, I mean, that's what we always talked about, that we could never do everything. We're just scratching the surface with the exhibition, but seeing it as a kind of platform in a way for gathering together existing research, and then becoming a launch pad. So yeah, it's been interesting also seeing how night studies in general has been an area of growth in the last few years, and maybe trying to start linking up with more of that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think even though that at times may seem strange to the people actually working in these club scenes, that they're looked at from an academic viewpoint or even from a museum viewpoint, because a museum is something totally different, and of course you wouldn't want to be musealized, as someone running a club. But I totally agree with you. I think I hope that it does show the importance, of nightlife and of clubs, and I hope it does show how important it is to support these clubs during this time, to, yeah,
Yeah.
to keep them alive, and so that maybe in some different way nightlife can restart after after the worst of this pandemic is over.
Mm. But also, I think the heritage question is so important because, a problem in general that we found was the lack of material. And partly that's around the kind of ephemeral nature of what we were looking at, but also that so many clubs closed without a trace.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all to do with the cultural value and other kind of issues. But if clubs are closing now, then, if there's going to be a wave of closures, then that issue is only going to be amplified. That, if you don't have the history, you can't tell the story of how important it is.
Yeah. So here's to every club owner listening: keep the things, keep
It's true.
flyers or at least some of it, interiors or whatever. And one day a museum may be coming and wanting acquire it for its collection.
Yeah, good point. A curatorial plea.
Yeah. All right. Well, maybe we had turned off this comment function, and let's see if there's any questions currently. No, just clapping hands. Well, then, thank you so much, Kat. It was a pleasure, as always, speaking with you. And we can also say that Night Fever will travel on, and it will open at the V&A Dundee in March next year. And we hope that it'll be brighter times then. And hope to see you there, Kat. And hope to see many of our listeners there for the show.
Thank you, Jochen. Nice speaking to you.
Yeah, very good to you. Thank you, Kat.
See you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.